In this video, I want to talk about how Ukraine can win the war. And I'm not talking about the specific tactics or where to attack or stuff like that, but in a more conceptual sense. Because it seems to me that many people assume that the only way Ukraine can win the war is if they can throw the Russians out. And then we get into a discussion about whether Ukraine has the strength to do that. And it's sort of assumed that if Ukraine can't push the Russians back, then Russia will win the war. But I think that is too narrow to look at it like that. So here I want to discuss a couple of different ways that Ukraine could win the war. The war in Ukraine has very much turned into a war about territory, and that is interesting because it is not really how most people discuss the war in the first month or so. Back then, it was mostly understood as a war about regime change, so Russia's way to win was to remove the Zelensky government and replace them with somebody else, and Ukraine's way to win was to resist, so that wouldn't happen. But since Russia changed their focus to Donbass in the end of March, it has become a war that I think most people understand in terms of territory. So it is basically about how much territory Russia can steal from Ukraine and how much territory Ukraine can manage to take back. And I think this leads people to assume that this sort of exchange of territory is basically how the outcome of the war is decided. But it doesn't have to be like that. So I think there are basically three ways that Ukraine can achieve their goals. And I think it's important to keep in mind because if you only consider one of these ways, then you might get a wrong idea about how it's going. And just to be clear, these three ways that I will be talking about are inspired by something that I saw Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov say in an interview. I didn't actually see the interview. I just saw it referred to by Stefan Korshak over on Facebook. And if you're interested in following this war, I think you really should follow Stefan because his updates on the war are just amazing. But anyways, I think these three bullets encapsulate my thoughts pretty well, so I'm going to use them, just bearing in mind that Reznikov probably said something similar, and that this shows that the Ukrainian government also works with this notion that there are several possible ways to win the war. The first way that Ukraine can win is by pushing the Russian army back to the borders prior to February 23rd, and then they can start to negotiate from there. So this is the very territorial understanding of the war that I think most people imagine. This is where Ukraine launches a counteroffensive and basically fights for every kilometer of terrain until the very last Russian soldier is thrown out. And if you believe that this is the only way Ukraine could win the war, then the big question is, of course, whether Ukraine can get a big enough upper hand to do that, because you would assume that if Russia can keep the territories that they have taken in the south and they can sort of maintain their slow progress in Donbass, then Russia is gaining territory and Russia is slowly winning. But there is also another way that Ukraine can win, and that is a more sudden kind of victory where Russia just suddenly decides to stop the fight. So instead of Ukraine gradually winning back territory, there could be a kind of collapse among the Russian forces. And I think a good example of this is how basically the Taliban beat the West in Afghanistan. They didn't win the territory back per se, but rather one day the Americans eventually decided that they had had enough and then they went home. And it took the Taliban 20 years to do this, but Ukraine is much better equipped and the Russians are taking much bigger losses than the West did in Afghanistan. So it might go a lot faster. And the point here is that, in my opinion, Ukraine doesn't necessarily have to take back a lot of territory in order to win. The most important thing is that the Russian army is taking big losses and that this continues for a long time and that the perspective is that this is just going to continue forever. because that can create the conditions where Russia decides that they can't do this anymore, that the consequences of continuing the war are too big because it is undermining the Russian army or the Russian society altogether. And this can lead to Ukraine suddenly regaining a lot of territory all at once. And this is actually very similar to how Russia decided to leave the northern parts of Ukraine. There, they didn't fight for every kilometer. They just suddenly sort of retreated with some kind of excuse. So a sudden collapse of the Russian effort is the second way that Ukraine can win the war. The third way is actually in some ways very similar to the second one. Or at least on the ground in Ukraine, it will probably look more or less like the same kind of sudden collapse. But the third way is that Putin somehow loses power in Russia. So it could be that he is ousted entirely, or maybe just that there is so much internal pressure on him that he loses that monopoly on decision-making. We discussed this possibility in my interview with Brian Taylor, so if you haven't seen that, you can do that. But essentially, the idea is that leadership change in Russia has often led to very dramatic policy changes. So we've often seen that the new leader comes in and sets a very different course for Russia. And I think when we look at the question of Ukraine's role in the world, then there is no doubt that this is a topic that Putin is personally interested in. I think we can almost say that he has an unhealthy obsession with Ukraine. Like, it's a topic that he has studied in great detail, and he is visibly passionate when he talks about Ukraine. And he even wrote a very, very long sort of pseudo-academic article about Ukraine and its relationship with Russia. And I think many of Putin's basic ideas about Ukraine are something that is shared among many Russians, but his passion about the topic is personal. Like, not every Russian is that obsessed with Ukraine. And I think a new leadership of Russia could use the opportunity to stop the war and to basically blame Putin for everything, that he gets the blame for Russia's problems because of his sort of personal obsessions and mistakes. So it could be a bit like the way, I guess, Khrushchev criticized Stalin after his death. So the most important difference between the second and the third bullet is that in bullet 2, it is Putin who makes the decision to stop the war. And in the third one, Putin has lost power, at least partly. And I think both of these scenarios are possible. The second one is more or less the same scenario that I discussed in a previous video, where I discussed whether Putin could ever accept a defeat in Ukraine. If you haven't seen that video, I think you should. But the short answer is yes. There are definitely circumstances where Putin could make that choice, at least I'd say until Russia goes through with an annexation of the occupied territories. That would burn a lot of bridges. But for the time for the time being, Putin could get away with making that choice. And the third bullet is also possible. As I discussed with Brian Taylor, there is probably not going to be a coup against Putin right now. But on the other hand, the current Russian system is unsustainable in the long run. So there will be some kind of regime change eventually. And the war in Ukraine is definitely speeding up that process. Okay, that was my rundown of 3 ways that Ukraine can win the war. The most important point is that this gradual conquest of territory is only one way to do it. There is also the possibility of a very different kind of victory where it looks like nothing is happening for a long time and then suddenly things go fast. And which one of these scenarios that can come in play, I think, will depend on how strong Ukraine is. The fastest way to win will probably be scenario 1, where they have a counteroffensive and they regain territory by pushing the Russians out. And if they don't have the strength to do that, then then scenario 2 will probably be the fast end, be fastest. This is the scenario where Ukraine is not strong enough to push the Russian forces out, but still strong enough that the attrition becomes a long-term problem for the Russian army. And then if Ukraine isn't strong enough to do that either, so it turns out that the Russian army can indeed sustain the war in the long run, then they can still win by outlasting Putin. Like, he's not going to be around forever. And if the war is a drain on Russia, then Putin's successor might use the opportunity to get out. And I don't want to be deterministic here. There are definitely also ways that Ukraine could lose the war, but that's a topic for another video. The most important thing was that I just think we need to remember that there are more than one way that Ukraine could win the war. Because from the public debate, it seems to me that many people are only considering one of them. And then they think that if Ukraine can't have a successful counteroffensive, then they are losing. And I think that is a too narrow interpretation, because there are other ways that Ukraine can win, where they target Russia's ability to continue the war in the long run. So they can win even if they aren't making territorial gains. Okay, with that, I'll end it here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.